This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. For some, the holiday season can be a time of joy and community, with days off of work and school and time with family. But for survivors of domestic violence, this time of year can be dangerous. Tense family dynamics, financial stress, and increased alcohol consumption are just a few of the reasons behind a rise in domestic violence this time each year. That's according to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So, across Connecticut, survivor support organizations are preparing for a season of increased need. And with the recent expiration of American Rescue Plan Act funds, some worry that their work will become even more difficult. This hour, we'll hear from advocates about how they're planning for the next few months. And just a quick note to listeners, we will be discussing adult themes like intimate partner violence. I'm joined by Megan Scanlon, who's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Megan, welcome back to Where We Live.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Danelle De La Rocher, Senior Director of Community Programs at Prudence Crandall Center. Danelle, thank you so much for being with us today as well.
Thank you. Good morning.
And also with us is Sheila Hare, who's a clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. Sheila, thanks for joining us as well.
Thanks for having us.
And also for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions or if you would like to share any experiences. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Megan, I want to start with you. Can you help us sort of understand the scale of this problem? About how many people does the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, or CCADV, serve in Connecticut each year?
Yeah. So the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence is made up of 18 sites across the state, and we serve about 40,000 survivors and their children a year through those 18 sites.
And with those 18 sites, are people able to find the resources to get help?
So we like to say yes. So through those 18 sites, we provide shelter services, counseling, help with restraining orders, protective orders, basic needs advocacy, advocacy for children. So we really try to meet every need that we possibly can of the survivors and their children or their family members. We do that through state and federal funds, obviously mostly, and some private fundraising across the state. And that's obviously getting more and more challenging as the barriers to exiting our system are getting a little bit more challenging. And we're seeing people, unfortunately, stay in our system longer than they have in the past.
And can you explain or expound more on who you serve? Because you mentioned, families and their children,
Sure.
But I think it's also a lot more people than we think, right?
Yeah. So, typically the majority of the individuals that we serve are women and their children or dependents, but we certainly serve men across the state. But our issue doesn't really it goes across demographics and socioeconomics. So you can come to us and be from various different parts of the state with various different means or lack of means. And all of our services are free, safe, and confidential. There's no income requirements. There's none of that. You don't even have to necessarily give us your name if you don't want to. So this issue, I think we've talked about this in the past, it just cuts across all socioeconomics. And it's a safety issue first and foremost, but then we like to talk about it as a public health issue as well.
Right. And Sheila, you also work with people experiencing domestic violence at the Civil Justice Clinic at Quinnipiac. So can you talk about who do you primarily work with here?
Well, we don't have any strict income requirements, but because the need is so great and the number of folks in the air providing this population with services is so few, we do try to focus as much as we can on low income folks. And what's interesting is I specialize in immigration. And so we are working with populations that ironically are eligible for legal status. Like there's an agreement on all sides that this population of folks experiencing violence deserves help and deserves status so that they can escape this violence and that is pervasive in our communities. So those are the folks we help, essentially connecting them with services, but more importantly, informing them that they're eligible for status.
Well, and with that in mind too, can you talk about more about how being undocumented complicates the process of navigating an abusive environment?
Well, yes, and I want to say there's a lot of misconceptions about immigration, and the families and the clients we serve are mostly mixed status, and we find that across the board in Connecticut. That is families that have undocumented folks as well as documented folks in the family, and it's really, really hard on the immigration system today to become legal. So these remedies are so important. And I think the average American, including myself before I studied this, thought, that the movie Green Card or 2 Weeks Notice with Sandra Bullock was like how things work. You marry somebody and you can get status, or wow, you have a US citizen kid and they can sponsor you. In fact, the system is a lot more challenging. So we've got, 10 to 12, possibly a million people in this country without much hope of becoming legal until we see a change. So yeah, and I think the fact that people don't have status, even if they have like kids who are U.S. citizens, which is a lot of the folks I serve, the fear around status really prevents them from accessing all kinds of services. There's so many vulnerabilities. Language, first and foremost. They feel like they can't access jobs. And a lot of times I would point out the abuser will tell them, you are undocumented in this country, and so you cannot access jobs. Social services, I mean, things like schools for their kids sometimes, lunches, free lunches, the court system, police, lawyers, healthcare. And, we've talked to law enforcement. This is where it's an interesting coalition of folks who have told me, and this was, a decade ago, we go out when we're trying to investigate crimes, not just domestic violence, but all sorts of crimes in the undocumented community. And we get names and numbers, and then we go back to our offices and start picking up the phone and realize they're pseudonyms and, fake numbers, because people are terrified when they're undocumented to report crimes and interact with the system. And so, these sorts of remedies that we work on, for example, the U visa that allows victims of serious crime to get status, or the VAWA petition, Violence Against Women, folks who are in marriages, for example, that may be abusive, who want to somehow get out and reach help. These remedies, I think, recognize that when we are able to encourage these victims or survivors to come forward and tell their stories and help law enforcement, we are all safer. Because in my experience, I always think, oh, he may just be abusing his wife, but in fact, you find out that there are other people that are being abused as well.
Well, we'll definitely be talking more about those nuances as well throughout this conversation. Danelle, I would love for you to tell us about the work being done at the Prudence Crandall Center as well, because it's been in operation for a very long time. Oh, Danelle, I think your audio is a bit funky right now. Let's give it a try again, Danelle. Okay, we're gonna work with Danelle's audio for a moment. So we'll come back to you, Danelle, once we get that together. But Megan, I want to come back to you, especially with what Sheila has just shared. In your experience, would you say that the scale of the problem has been growing or decreasing?
Yeah, I actually do. And I want to add to what Sheila said before, too. So I think she touched on a couple important things. One is that the perpetrator of abuse will absolutely use the lack of information, lack of knowledge, and fear of the immigration system against both the victim and children and other dependents that might be in the household, like, elders or others. So I think that's a very real part of the coercive control that can happen in a household. And then the other piece that we often talk about with communities is that oftentimes in the communities that they come from, the countries, backgrounds, cultures, domestic violence is not necessarily a crime. And so there's an education just on that basic level of the fact that family violence is a crime in Connecticut. It's a crime across the country. And so that they do have access to services and have the ability to voice concern and speak out in terms of that victim perspective. So I think those are two things. But getting to what you were talking about, I think that, the issue that we're dealing with is complex, and it's unique to each survivor and their household. And I think that as we are trying to work with individuals across the state, we want to make sure that they understand that we're not going to recommend something that they're not ready to access in terms of services. So we work with our partners like Sheila and the Connecticut Legal Services and Greater Hartford Legal Aid to access services that make sense for individuals. We take a survivor-centered approach to this work. And we really want to make sure that individuals know that. So when they come to our service system, we're not going to force them to put their safety at risk. We're going to work with them on that. But then what I think has happened over time, especially since the pandemic, that has made it harder for individuals to leave and find safe situations is just the complexities of needs. So we have individuals entering our system now that may have a legal status issue that we absolutely can help them with, but they also might have mental health and substance use issues. Their kids might require special supports in school. So they have those concerns. They have concerns about, like Sheila said, employment or access to employment. All of those things we can help and assist, and it's all free of charge. And we have advocates that are educated or trained, constantly get continuing education from our partners across the state, as well as our national folks on how to navigate these systems. So I think the issue has become that there's this access issue to our system. That's first and foremost. But then once you're in the system, what we found is that working with other systems, we're really trying to make it easier to navigate those systems. So we're advocating at the state and federal level for various administrative and legislative changes to make it easier for survivors and their families to access services. But we also recognize that there's some barriers that we're up against that we have no control over, like access to safe and affordable childcare or access to safe and affordable housing. Those are our top two biggest barriers for families that enter our system, outside of obviously the legal system that often they have to navigate. So I think that's kind of where we are as a state is what are we going to do to assist people in real time, but then also work on some of these bigger systemic issues that impact survivors and their families.
Well, and then with some of the infrastructure we have in place, which includes the Prudence Crandall Center, which has been in operation for a while. Danelle, I believe you're back with us. Can you tell us more about the work that's being done at the center?
Yes, absolutely. We've been around for 50 years. This is our 50th year anniversary. So we are one of the oldest in the country, actually, that has served survivors of intimate partner violence and domestic violence over the years. And we provide a whole variety of services from emergency shelter to counseling and support group programs. We also have rapid rehousing and permanent housing supportive options. So those are kind of an extenuation of shelter services for folks that may have found themselves having to leave a violent situation, and now they're trying to rebuild their lives. But, credit and financially and all of that goes into finding a new apartment, especially in the current state that our housing market is in, is really difficult. So we really try to help advocate for folks to get them into safe and healthy environments for themselves and their children.
Well, and then we mentioned earlier that we're in the holiday season now and how this time of the year can be worse than usual for people experiencing domestic violence. Can you talk about more of that? Why is that the case, Danelle?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, this time of year is stressful for many people, and there's a lot of different things that come up during the holidays, but I think the financial stress is huge, and we don't realize how much goes into intimate partner violence and domestic violence because it's a pervasive problem that affects so many different areas of a person's life. So it may not just be a physical situation. It could be, the financial burden, and then maybe mental abuse or emotional abuse, humiliation, things like that. So you kind of have this perfect storm of financial stressors, maybe family stressors, and then ongoing sort of abusive tactics that may be going on throughout the year. It just sort of ramps up, I think, around the holidays. And I'll never forget a family that had come into our shelter on Christmas Eve one year because it had really escalated to that point that they needed to get out of the home. So, it may be a happy holiday for some, and for others, it can be really, really stressful.
And Megan, I want to jump to you real quick here in terms of, people who are especially what Danelle just said, their family is able to leave, but for people fleeing abusive relationships or situations, anonymity and being able to escape is so important. But living in a digital age, it's so easy to track each other. Whether or not you can turn a location mode off of your phone, there are still ways that you can track people with other sort of digital advancements in technology. So in this case, how does that change the work that you do?
So we safety plan around it. So there's a lot of great things about technology, and there's a lot of, in doing this work, you kind of realize all the ways that somebody could take advantage of that and use it as a controlling tactic. So our advocates across the state try to safety plan on that. We'll ask really direct questions around, like, do you have location services on or off? Is it going to make you more at risk of your abuser, acting more violently toward you or less violently. So, and that's where it gets to, like, it's really an individual plan, because the individual coming to us for services knows that person better than we do. So we're going to ask those really direct questions around, like, if we were to change your phone, if we were to turn location off, if we were to do these things, what would be the reaction? Are you going to be less safe or more safe in doing so? And so that's what I mean around they have full control over what they do or do not do. And then we obviously, like Sheila said, law enforcement is obviously a big partner in the work that we do. So we have, in every law enforcement agency across the state, we have a DV, domestic violence liaison. They can also go over some of those concerns and work with our advocates across the state to make sure that they're taking as many precautions as they possibly can. That's realistic for their situation in order to stay safe that way, including their children, because obviously children are utilizing the technology as well.
Well, and Sheila, before we go to break, I do want to ask, earlier we're talking about the immigration community, and right now there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric being used in political spaces, and talking about, like, technology in the digital area as well with social media. That rhetoric can be shared even more often and more widely. Does this have an impact on the work that you do at the clinic, Sheila?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, what we're seeing, one of the things I like to say is in the first Trump administration, we saw a lot of talk, right? And one of the things we are trying as advocates is to really counter some of the chilling effect that this talk creates, because Trump has various plans, but sometimes the bark is, worse than the bite in some sense. And a lot of these provisions we're ready to challenge them in courts. And so a lot of times it's about informing immigrants that they do have rights, and that they can go to the police, and that they can access courts to get custody of their kids, and essentially to counter the narratives that they're hearing from their abusers and possibly from the media about the lack of ability to access social services and safety.
You've been listening to Sheila Hare, who's the clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University, and also Daniel DeRocher, who's the senior director of community programs at Prudence Crandall Center, and Megan Scanlon, who's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Coming up, they'll be talking about the impact of federal funding cuts on services for survivors of domestic violence. And if you need help or just someone to talk to, visit ctsafeconnect.org or call or text 888-774-2900, 888-774-2900. Advocates are available 24/7. And if you have any questions for our guests, you can also give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And another note for our listeners that we here at Connecticut Public, we're having our December pledge drive. And when you consider your year-end of giving, if you enjoy today's show or if you rely on the independent news and information you hear every day here at Connecticut Public, please consider a donation. It will mean a lot to us and it will mean a lot to me. Our funding isn't guaranteed. It's really dependent on our community, to listeners like you. So if you can give us a quick donation, we would very much appreciate it. Visit ctpublic.org. Here's two of my colleagues to tell you more. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Recently, domestic violence survivor services across the state have been supported by the American Rescue Plan Act funds. But those funds recently expired. So what now? With me today is Sheila Hare. She's a clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. Danelle De La Rocher is the senior director of community programs at Prudence Crandall Center. And Megan Scallon, who's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And just another note for our listeners that we will be continuing to discuss intimate partner violence. So I want to jump straight to you, Megan. Actually, in September, CT Insider reported that a nonprofit organization in Wethersfield called Survivors of Homicide, which has been in operation since 1983, they were bracing for closure due to funding cuts. So are closures or fear of closures widespread in the domestic violence services sector right now?
Yeah, I think all victim services are entering a period of uncertainty, just like every other human service provider. I think it's a nationwide issue. So every single coalition across the country, we have 56 between the U.S. states and territories, we're all dealing with this issue in very different ways. And so what it means for Connecticut is that we've been really lucky to have a governor and a legislature that has appropriated ARPA dollars for the past 3 years, because this issue goes back to 2019, so under the Trump administration. The first time, what happened was there was a loophole in the law for victims of crime act funds that they could be swept to the general treasury, which is what the Trump administration decided to do. So it depleted the funds. These are non-taxpayer forms of revenue that come from mostly white collar restitution from prosecutions. Depleted the fund. So we have this nationwide problem of how are we going to fund victim services? And obviously domestic violence is one of them, survivors of homicide, sexual violence, child abuse. All of the victim services across the state are grappling with this issue of how do we move forward. What I can tell you about the domestic violence service system is, we are advocating this upcoming session for the legislature to invest state funds into 3 critical areas that we worked with our member programs across the state to look at data utilization over the summer. And so we're prioritizing our adult advocates that really work as you come into our system. They're sort of our generalists. They safety plan with you. They help with restraining orders. They're the lifeline to how you enter our system. Our statewide domestic violence resource hotline, CT Safe Connect, that you've mentioned before, that's the main entry point for how people can call, text, email, or chat to get help and services and a warm handoff to one of our member programs. And then our criminal court advocates. So not every state in the country has this, but we have family violence victim advocates in our court system. They work directly with prosecution and defense and others within the court system to make sure that our victims have their input into that court proceeding or process, and that they're able to understand the process from the time it starts to whenever there is a disposition in the case. So those are our priorities in the state of Connecticut. We're hopeful that the governor and the legislature will fund those priorities. But you're talking about a massive cut, a 70% cut to victim services in the state of Connecticut. So that's where we are.
And Danelle, kind of an obvious question here, building on what Megan just shared, is what do these budget cuts mean for people working the field? Are you concerned about short staffing and also burnout?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's always, our staff and advocates listen to traumatic stories day after day, hour after hour sometimes, really difficult situations that they're working really hard to help with. So that's always on the forefront of my mind. And then to kind of think of these services potentially getting cut. I know in New Britain Courthouse, we served around 4,500 clients last year, and we have 4 victim advocates in that court, which means that each person was seeing over 1,000 clients on their caseload, which is really staggering and very eye-opening. So to think that there would be cuts to that and that could place more burden, or that we see these numbers continuing to grow, it's just, there's a lot of concern around how we would, manage all of that in the upcoming, year.
And Catherine, if I may jump in,
Yeah.
I just hear that this is going to impact all populations, especially the immigrant population. But it's so important when you're first hearing from someone who's experiencing domestic violence, interpartner violence, to really take the time to understand where they're coming from. As we've talked, like, it's a full puzzle of needs and concerns that you have to address in order for the person to feel ready to take action. And the stories I hear of folks calling the first time and the person's busy or the language is not there. I'm working with a woman who experienced horrific, like life-threatening abuse 10 years ago. And it's only now that she's been able to come forward. And I just fear with these budget cuts, we're going to see people just sort of not feeling comfortable enough to come forward and pursue their legal rights.
Well, and so related to what you just mentioned, Sheila, but just a quick note for our listeners again, that if you do need help or if you want to have someone to talk to, please visit ctsafeconnect.org or call or text 888-774-2900. That's 888-774-2900. You can call or text that number. Advocates are available 24/7. So Sheila, earlier you mentioned, people calling in. How important is that first interaction or first phone call with a domestic violence survivor? Because, if the person they reach is burnt out, or even worse, there's nobody there to pick up the phone, how likely is someone to keep seeking help?
Oh, I think in my experience, it's just heartbreaking to hear the number of people who've tried once, and for whatever reason, the phone call had to get cut short, or there was something going on at the agency. They were trying to find a translator. I've heard innumerable stories about folks who put it off for years, right? Because I say folks coming forward in these circumstances, it really takes a tremendous leap of faith, and they're at that critical moment. And if you don't reach the person at that critical moment, we see people staying in abusive settings, and not just themselves, but their children, in my experience, who are often U.S. citizen kids experiencing that. And that has, spillover effects in all of their lives and in our institutions going forward. So it's critical. And I think this funding is absolutely critical. So I fear what we're going to see in the coming years.
Well, and then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, Danelle, would funding cuts also potentially deter someone from pursuing a career to support and advocate for domestic violence survivors?
I think, working in the nonprofit sector, this is not a field that you're going to make, $1 million, but
Right.
There's definitely a passion that you have to be able to do this job. And the dedication that we see from the employees that we have now. I mean, there's barriers upon barriers that can get thrown in our way, and we find a way to make it work. So my hope is that we continue to have that spirit and that drive to make it work for folks, because we know that these are sometimes life and death situations and they need our help.
And Sheila, with what Danelle just shared too, it sounds like the community is a place for survivors and for advocates that can be really life-changing. And like Danelle mentioned, so much passion here to help people. Have you seen the positive impacts of seeking help firsthand? Do you have any stories that you can share with us?
Oh, absolutely. I had a client who had been in this country for 20 years, undocumented, local. She lived in the Valley, she spoke primarily Spanish, very little English. Both of her kids were U.S. citizens, teenagers, and her husband, who is legally in this country, would say, "You have no rights. If you complain about this domestic violence, I will call the police and I will have you deported. If you go to court to try to get child support or custody of the kids, even though she was clearly the primary caretaker, I will make sure the judge knows that you are undocumented and he will deport you and I will get the kids." And so that just gave this man free reign to do whatever he wanted. And in her mind, that was true. She couldn't work. She didn't have a driver's license. She didn't speak English. She wasn't familiar with the court system. And when we were able to work with her and sort of put some of those pieces together to reassure her that we could get her custody, that she could get child support, that she could actually reach out to the police. It was transformative. She got status, and I remember working with her for over a year. And then a couple of months after she got status, I got a phone call from her, and I didn't even realize it was her because I had never heard her speaking English. But it gave her this renewed approach to being in the United States. She was working two jobs, and even the kids were just, ready to just embrace being here. Even though they had been born in the United States, one was ready to join the military. Even their school performance improved. So it was just a really tremendous life change for the entire family.
Well, I think it's really important for people to hear that these are life-changing phone calls that could happen, but you have to make the phone call, but also certainly understand why there are barriers there to begin with. But hopefully we can start breaking those by having more of these conversations. You've been listening to Sheila Hare, who's the clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University, Danelle DeRocher, who's the senior director of community programs at Prudence Crandall Center, and Megan Scallon, who is with the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Coming up next, we'll talk about what someone can expect if they do call a domestic violence hotline. And again, if you need help or just someone to talk to, please visit ctsafeconnect.org or call or text 888-774-2900. 888-774-2900. Advocates are available 24/7. And if you have any questions for our experts, please give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. There are many resources for people experiencing domestic violence, but seeking support can feel really intimidating. What can survivors of domestic violence expect during that initial phone call? I want to jump straight to Megan with that question. Walk me through with someone who can what can they expect when they call the hotline? Who will pick up? And what if they're not completely ready to share all the details?
Absolutely. So the good news is that we have real live human beings that speak various languages that are there 24/7. So what you can expect is you'll talk, email, text, or chat with a real human being that's been trained in domestic violence. So they're an advocate, just like all of our advocates across the state. The answer is you can share as much as you want or as little as you want. They're going to have some basic questions for you around, basic information, and then the reason for you calling. Once you give them any amount of that, and it's up to you, they will then transfer you in a warm handoff to one of our member programs, and that's dependent on your geographic location or the geographic location that you would like to be in, and that's how we determine that. So, it's a couple minutes in terms of about a 5-minute interaction, and then you'll get handed off to our member program. They'll have more detailed questions that you may or may not want to answer, or you might want to set up a different appointment if you're not in immediate risk. But they'll assess for, are you safe in the moment? If the answer is yes, then we'll work on sort of how do we get you services. But if you're not safe in that moment, they will help to initiate a phone call to law enforcement if it's needed. So, and again, you can share as much as you want or as little as you want in that situation. So it's important for people to know, like Sheila said, we completely recognize that when you reach out, you're reaching out to a complete stranger. You're at your limit. You're putting a lot of trust in who's answering that phone call, and we appreciate that, and we train for that and make sure that we provide a quality service.
And Sheila, what can someone expect if they call Quinnipiac Civil Justice Clinic?
Well, we usually actually get referrals from outside the community, from advocates. But yes, people can call us. And a lot of times what we'll do is encourage. And one of the things I'd encourage people to do right now is if they don't actually have a live case that we can handle, sending them to one of the community agencies, like Building One Community. They are doing right now Know Your Rights presentations on a range of issues, from school to access to courts to how to interact with ICE should you encounter them. And one of the things the community of advocates is focusing on is actually sort of custody planning. So if families fear that a parent may be deported and the kids are here, whether they're U.S. citizens, which is the case in many families, or not, what happens when a child returns home from school to find that the parents are gone? How to talk to your child about this. I remember, back in previous administrations, I heard stories about parents telling kids, I kept the credit card underneath the fridge. So if you get home and we're not here, call the neighbor and here's the credit card. Well, there are going to be pro bono free help, essentially setting up standby guardianships in those cases. And we just encourage all families to think about that. I think as a parent, we always should be planning for what happens to the kids. And I think that's a helpful way to talk to the kids about this. Anything could happen. And so this is just a way that we can be better prepared. So there are definitely resources out there. And I would encourage people to call statewide legal services. We're going to have Know Your Rights trainings at libraries. Again, Building One Community is doing all sorts of free workshops. So my strong approach is to encourage people to reach out and attend some of these so that they know what rights they have.
And I'm going to ask all three of you later on to give out that information for listeners who may need it. But I want to jump to Danelle real quick here with the legislative session coming up. What are some of the priorities that your organizations will be paying attention to?
I think that we're definitely going to be paying attention primarily to the Victim of Crime Act fund cuts that are coming, and really looking at what our court service and court advocacy services are like, as well as our counseling and support services. As Megan was talking about, you can connect to one of these advocates and they are kind of they know all of these resources and they know all of these different options for people and whatever they're comfortable in sharing. And I think it's important to know that you don't have to be ready to leave. You could just be ready to talk about what's going on. And that's what the advocates are there for, to help navigate these really difficult situations. So, my hope is that those services can continue, and that the variety and the range of services, because they really are wraparound. This is truly someone's entire life that's impacted by domestic violence. So we really want to make sure that we're addressing all of the needs of that person.
And Danelle, earlier this was touched on a little bit, but on a national scale, because we're seeing some rhetoric like your body, my choice right now. Our president-elect Donald Trump also has a history of making comments about grabbing women. Does this larger national context impact the work that you're doing here in Connecticut?
Absolutely. I think that, there's a level of fear. Not only is there fear in domestic violence and living in these situations, but there's fear about coming forward. There's fear that nobody will care. When you're talking about immigrant populations, there's fear of deportation and just not knowing rights. And I think a lot of the jobs that advocates do is just explaining to people what their rights are under the law, and knowing what their options are that previously they were told were not options, or they've been told that they can't do these things for years. And so being able to really empower people and truly give them the power of choice is one of the most important things that we do. And, we need that support from the higher level in order to continue that.
And Danelle, if there are listeners out there who would like to volunteer or just to learn more information, how can they reach out to you?
Absolutely. So we are part of the Safe Connect hotline. So if they'd like to call, chat, or email, it's that same number, the 888-774-2900. But we also have our website at prudencecrandall.org. And that website talks about all of our services and ways to volunteer, intern, get in touch with us, and get in touch with the different variety of services that we have.
And Sheila, I know you get a lot of referrals, so if people want to reach out to you and your organization, what's the best way to do that?
The best way to do that is actually to call 203-582-3238, which is the number of our clinic. But I also would encourage people to reach out to local organizations like Statewide Legal Services. And again, I feel that with the changes coming forward, many of these organizations will be overwhelmed. So please, I always tell folks, I try these numbers myself, and sometimes you will get a busy line. Keep calling, and eventually you'll land in the right place. Statewide Legal Services is 860-344 0380. And Building One Community is 203-674-8585. And that last number is the organization in Stamford that is connecting with organizations across the state to do Know Your Rights and general, information to the public, and especially undocumented folks.
And we will have all this information available online at ctpublic.org/wherewelive after the show. And Megan, same question to you. If people want to get involved or just know more, how can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, so Danielle obviously already shared our statewide hotline, so that's one way. But then we do have our website. The coalition website is ctcadv.org. And that'll give you, ways that you can get involved, information. We have all of the state laws there that you can download and read as well. So to Sheila's point about knowing your rights, we have a lot of that information as it pertains to Connecticut on our website too.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing that information. Hopefully it'll be helpful for our listeners and those who really need it. You've been listening to Megan Scallon, who's the president and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Megan, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Also, Danelle DeRocher, who's the senior director of community programs at Prudence Crandall Center. Danelle, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
And also Sheila Hare, who's the clinical professor of law at Quinnipiac University. Sheila, thank you for being with us as well.
It was my pleasure. Thanks.
And for our listeners, if you need help or someone to talk to, please visit ctsafeconnect.org or call or text 888-774-2900. Advocates are available 24/7. And just another quick reminder that it is our December fund drive here at Connecticut Public. Consider supporting Where We Live and all of your favorite programming with a donation. We rely on you. If you rely on us for the independent news and information you hear every day, please consider a donation. Our funding isn't guaranteed, and you'll make a lot of people here happy with a donation. We would love to continue our work with you. And here are two more of my colleagues to tell you more.